For those of you who weren't here the last couple sessions, my name is Stephen Morgan. I'm one of the rabbis here at Beth Yeshurun. And this is Professor Matthias Henze, who's a professor of Jewish studies at Rice University. I guess early on I kidded him about it because he's a Lutheran teaching about Judaism at Rice University. And there's a famous Jewish professor, Amy Jo Levine, who teaches at the seminary at Vanderbilt about Jesus to Christians. So he's sort of our counterpart here in Houston, which I think is kind of a statement to say that really when you're talking about scholarship, scholars see things through a scholarly lens, and you can see it. You don't have to be an insider necessarily to have scholarly opinions on a subject. So tonight's subject is going to be our prayers and our hopes. That's usually the reverse of what people talk about, our hopes and our prayers. But I want to end on hopes, so we're going to talk about prayers first. That's sort of the more scholarly aspect of this. We're going to actually look at a couple of prayers in Judaism and Christianity, and then we'll kind of back off and sort of try and get the big picture with a conclusion of where do we go from here. So the way we organize tonight, I'm starting off talking about a couple of fundamental building blocks for Jewish prayer. I'll be spending a little bit of time developing those ideas, and then I'm going to turn it over to Matthias, who's going to sort of talk about general Christianity, but focusing on two particular important prayers in Christianity, and that's how we'll proceed. So for those people who are not Jewish, and maybe even for people who are Jewish but never thought about how the prayer book is organized, let me just briefly kind of give you a bird's eye view of what Jewish prayer is about. I'm talking about Jewish communal prayer, by the way. Anybody can pray anytime, any place, by themselves, and use whatever words they like. But when people come together to pray as a community, then we need to be on the same page, literally. And so therefore we need to have somebody write words on that page, and that creates a structure. So the two major structures in Jewish prayer are the Shema and its blessings, which is what I'm going to talk about a little later, and the other one is the Amidah. The Amidah is the Hebrew word for standing, because it is a prayer that is recited while standing. It can either be done at home as an individual privately, or you can do it in a community, as a congregation. By the way, a congregation in the Jewish world means 10 Jewish adults. If you're in the Orthodox Jewish world, those adults all have to be men. So, because originally only men counted in communal organizational structures. The conservative and reform movement now are egalitarian, so 10 Jewish adults count as a community, and you can come together to pray these prayers together. The Amidah the idea of it is that you're as an individual, you are coming into God's throne room, so to speak. That's obviously a metaphor, but you are kind of having a personal encounter with God. You introduce yourself to God first with the opening blessings. We announce God's holiness using a couple passages from the Bible, including one familiar to Christians from the prophet Isaiah. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. For those who do Latin Mass, it's Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus. Don't ask me what the rest is. I'm not a Latin expert, but I've heard the Latin Mass before, and I've recognized those words. So we recite that about God's holiness. Then we have several requests during the weekday Amidah. We recite a series of requests for God about individual needs, communal needs, and so on. And then we conclude with a thank you to God, and we excuse ourselves from God's presence, backing out and bowing. That's the Amidah. It's said 3 times a day. The Amidah, we believe, was originally structured to replace the temple sacrifice service. So your private Amidah would replace a private sacrifice that you might have brought to the temple, and the community Amidah, which is said if you're in a community, replaces the community offering that was offered in the temple by the priest twice every day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. So originally the Amidah was probably only said twice a day. However, because the Shema, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, was said twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, Jews decided, well, as long as we're saying the Shema in the evening, we ought to do another Amidah. So now we do 3 Amidas a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. Is everybody with me so far? Okay, good. So now I want to focus on the Shema and its blessings. That's the other central prayer unit. And we're not exactly sure when it got organized this way, but 3 paragraphs from the 5 books of Moses were seen as having a unified structure, and they were stuck together. And I refer you to the handout. The first one is Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9, which we'll look at closely, and then Deuteronomy 11, 13 to 21, and then finally Numbers 15, chapter 15, verses 37 to 41. Those 3, for whatever reason, were put together as a structure, a unit. One modern scholar, Reuven Kimmelman, has suggested that this maybe others as well, have suggested that the Shema may have been a reenactment of the scene at Mount Sinai when the Israelites are receiving the 10 Commandments. Elements of this first of all, the passage in Deuteronomy 6 immediately follows the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy. And the idea that I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt is the opening for the 10 Commandments. Here we're saying, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, seems to be a similar statement. So it may be sort of a reenactment of that Mount Sinai scene. In any case, let's take a look now at the first paragraph of the Shema series, 6, 4 through 9. The first sentence, as I said, is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord alone, or the Lord is one. And then a statement that is familiar to all Christians, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Obviously a commandment to love God in a very intense way. Then it says, take to heart these instructions which I charge you this day, impress upon them to your children. The translation impress comes from the Hebrew verb vishinantam, which is to teach them. But in Judaism, we have different words for teaching. So the lishanen is to teach by repetition over and over and over again until you memorize it, something I happen to know that Professor Henze likes, memorization, right? So you're supposed to teach kids so that it really is on their heart. This is something that is completely on their mind every single moment. So you should teach them to your children, and you talk about them at home and when you're away, when you lie down and when you get up. And when you lie down and get up is the basis for Jews reciting it twice a day, right? When you lie down and when you rise up. Naturally, Jews had to argue about this because we argue about everything. So the argument was, does it literally mean when your head hits the pillow at night and when your eyes first open in the morning? Or does it just mean sometime in the evening and sometime in the morning? The more lenient opinion of the school of Hillel won. The more lenient opinion of school of Hillel almost always won. They had a majority in the Senate, as it were, the majority in what we call the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court. And so they almost always won. And so with the more lenient opinion is any time that you do it in the evening is okay and any time in the morning is okay. Then you should bind them as a sign on your hand, that they should serve as a symbol between your eyes. If you have seen Jews wearing distinctive leather boxes that are black leather boxes on their arm and on their forehead, we may look a little bit to a novice. We say, what are those Jews wearing those things on their heads and arms for? That's because we took this passage literally, so we write it out on a piece of parchment, stuff it in a black box, and then fasten it on our arm and before our eyes. Why would it say to do that? On your eyes puts it in your mind all the time, and on your arm is in your actions, right? So in all your actions and all your thoughts, you're thinking about the fact that there's one God, and you should love God and do what God wants you to do. And then inscribe them on the doorposts of your house, which we call the mezuzot. So you may see on the doorpost of a Jewish home a little ornamental box. Again, we've taken this passage, written it on parchment, put it inside the box, and put it on the doorpost to fulfill this verse. Why is it on the doorpost? I will give you the rational answer given by Maimonides in the 12th century, which seems to me to be the obvious answer. It just told you that when you walk on the way and when you sit at home, you're supposed to think about these words. So when you leave your house to walk on the way, you pass by this reminder, right, that you're supposed to think about them. And then when you come home from outside, when you come home, you're reminded that you're supposed to think about them at home, right? It's simply a another mnemonic device to remember about these commandments. So that's the first paragraph. I will skip the other two paragraphs and then talk about the package it comes in. So in rabbinic tradition, we usually have as part of our prayer services, passages from the Bible, but we encapsulate them in rabbinic blessings, rabbinically crafted blessings, words that they crafted to sort of surround the biblical passage. And in the case of the Shema, there are two blessings we recite before the Shema and one blessing we recite afterwards. And the three themes for them are mentioned in the little arrow there. The first one is about God being the creator. These prayers were originally somewhat fluid, and prayer writers could be creative about how they wrote about them. So we have different versions of these prayers. Eventually, when the printed prayer book came into being, the ones people liked the most ended up getting into the prayer books. So now we have only one or two versions in the printed prayer books because that's all that's left. The other ones you have to go look for ancient manuscripts for. But the one in the evening talks mostly about God creating the sun, moon, and stars, because you can see the moon and stars at night, but talking about God's creation. And in the morning, not surprisingly, we talk about God creating light as we wake up and see the sun in the sky. Then God as revealer, the paragraph I'm going to look at in a moment. And finally, God as redeemer, that is, God has a presence in our lives as Israelites, has had a covenant with the Israelite people for centuries. And the moment that we recall most impassionedly, I would say in the Jewish world, is that formative moment when we became a free people, right? We were a clan with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We became a people in Egypt, but we were enslaved. So when we left Egypt, for the first time, we had our freedom. It's sort of like the 4th of July for America, right? And so that's the moment that we celebrate and we remember about God's presence in our lives at that moment. And that is specifically when we cross the Red Sea. It's not the 10 plagues in Egypt or the escape from Egypt. It's not until we were able to escape the Egyptian army, and the army is destroyed in the sea, and therefore no longer able to capture us and bring us back, that we're truly a free people. That's the moment when we celebrate and we sing a song maybe you've heard before, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, who is like you, God amongst the mighty. And we rejoice in that song, and that becomes sort of the end of this last blessing. Now let's look at the one about, and this is the thing I'm going to end on and then turn it over to Matthias Henze. So the second blessing before the Shema talks about God being a revealer of wisdom. In our tradition, it's the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. And so this is how the prayer goes in the morning version. I said there's a couple versions out there. We have a little bit of a different version in the evening. This is the morning version. With a great love, you have loved us, Lord our God, with a great and superabundant compassion. Have you had compassion upon us, our Father, our King, for the sake of our fathers who trusted in you and you taught them the laws of life, so too grace us and teach us. Our Father and merciful Father, the merciful one, have mercy on us. Put into our hearts to understand and to comprehend and to listen and to study and to teach and to keep and to do and preserve all the words of the study of your Torah with love. Lots of verbs there about the Torah. And enlighten our eyes in your Torah and make our hearts cling to your commandments. Unite our hearts to love and fear your name. And may we never be embarrassed. Since we have trusted in your great, awesome name, let us rejoice and be gladdened by your salvation. I'm going to stop there for a moment. I mentioned to Professor Henze when we discussed this that I have thought for the last several years that this particular prayer may be an answer to Paul. So he can comment on this. But Paul, as my understanding is, sort of saw a distinction between the covenant of law, which is the Old Testament, and the covenant of love, which is the New Testament, and in a sort of a superiority of the second over the first. And we know that there was some interaction of the early Jewish and Christian communities at this time. And I'm wondering if the Jewish writer of this prayer didn't have Paul in mind when he wrote this, because he's saying, no, this is how we understand it. Law and love are really two sides of the same coin. God loves us so much, he gave us the law. Sort of like parents, when you're bringing up your children, you want to teach them right from wrong. That's what God was doing for us. And we, in turn, as we said above in Deuteronomy, we in turn love God and express our love by following the commandments he gave us. Now, I have to say also that the Bible is full of examples where the Israelites did not follow God's law and made mistakes. Right? We didn't hide the dirty linen. And that, unfortunately, continues today. There's many, nobody's perfect, but some people are more perfect than others. But it is true. It's hard to keep all the commandments. But the ideal is to follow these rules. Now, I just want to make one last comment, and then I'll turn it over to Professor Henze. The last couple lines. Bring us in peace from the four corners of the earth, and lead us directly to our land, as you are the God who performs salvations, and you have chosen us from among all nations and languages. You brought us close to your great name forever in truth. Praised are you, and unify you with love. Blessed are you who chooses people Israel with love. So this is another thing that happened in these early Jewish prayers. This last couple sentences inserts an idea that doesn't belong here. Right? What doesn't belong here is bring us from the four corners of the earth and take us to our homeland. This is a prayer that's supposed to be about how much God loves us. He gave us the rules to follow. And all of a sudden, we're setting that aside and saying, and by the way, bring us home again from the four corners of the earth. That idea creeps into virtually every single prayer in the prayer book in places it doesn't belong. And I don't mention this necessarily as a political thing for today, but just to say that ever since the Romans kicked the Israelites, or the Jewish people, out of Jerusalem after the Bar Kokhba revolt and turned it into a pagan city, the Jews have longed to go home. It's not a 19th century Zion, political movement. This is part of what's been in the DNA structure for 2,000 years. We want to go home, and it's been in our prayers like this one that we recite every single day in all kinds of places where it doesn't normally belong, because it's important to us and how we understand our own identity.
Great, thank you very much. Good evening. So we're taking a giant step from Judaism to the earliest texts from Christianity that we have, and you can follow along on page 2 of your handout. So like in Judaism, there are several prayers in the Christian liturgy that are taken straight from the Bible. And before I turn to the two examples on your handout, I just want to mention very briefly two examples. One is the example that Rabbi Morgan himself already mentioned, namely in Isaiah 6, Isaiah's call narrative, where Isaiah is in the temple in Jerusalem. He sees the seraphim, these angelic-esque flying figures, worshiping God by saying, "Holy, holy, holy." And I have several colleagues of mine who have written articles about the reception history of just that one verse in Judaism and Christianity, and it is quite remarkable. It is all over, and of course survives into the worship today, so it is part of every Christian worship. The idea being that if you recite these verses from the prophet Isaiah, you are you're participating in the ongoing worship in heaven. Right? You're joining with the angelic hosts, and you're becoming one in the praise of God. And another example would, of course, be the Psalms. We could teach another class together about the use of the biblical Psalms in Jewish and Christian liturgies. The Psalms are a standard part of the Christian liturgy as well, of course. And I think the idea is that in reciting the Psalms, you're participating in the worship of ancient Israel. So I use these two examples, Isaiah and the Psalms, as examples of how the Christian community that worships God quite deliberately does so, not in segregation, but participates in a worship that has very ancient roots. So today I want to look at two texts, both of which are on your handout, the so-called Magnificat and then the Lord's Prayer. I want to be a little shorter on the first one and perhaps say a little more about the Lord's Prayer because it's really at the core of Christian identity. But let me spend 5 or 6 minutes on the Magnificat, the first prayer there. So the story is that one of the four evangelists, one of the four gospel writers, namely Luke, the writer of the third gospel, tells the story of Jesus' birth and upbringing, and he interrupts himself 5 times in the first 2 chapters and inserts short poems, songs, blessings into his narrative. And I've listed on the handout these 5 poems. The first one is the Ave Maria. This is not the text that Gabriel says that then becomes the prayer. This is Elizabeth greeting Mary as she visits her. Then the second that I listed here is what's known in the Christian tradition as the Benedictus. This is Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. Then there's, of course, the Gloria in Excelsis Deo. These are the angels that sing when they learn of the birth of the Messiah. And then the last one is the Nunc Dimittis. It's a beautiful, short text said by an individual about whom we know very little. His name is Simeon. Luke just tells us he was a righteous and devout man in the temple, and when Joseph and Mary come and present Jesus to the temple, he praises God and says, now you let your servant go in peace, your word has been fulfilled, I have seen the salvation which you have prepared. So he thanks God for allowing him to die in peace, because now what he has longed for all of his life has become true. And so in many Christian worships, these words are recited at the end of the service. Now you let your servant go in peace, your word has been fulfilled.
That's interesting. I just now explained the scene in the Ten Commandments. Well, I don't know if you remember this, but there's a scene in the Ten Commandments where Moses, I think, after beating up the Egyptian taskmasters, the old Jewish guy says, I know I finally lived to see the Redeemer of our people. He has that, and I'm sure that Cecil B. DeMille had that verse in mind.
That's exactly the idea.
Put that in, yeah.
So the most famous, perhaps, of these 5 poems is, of course, the song that Mary herself sings, which is known as the Magnificat after its Latin version. That's where it gets its name from. Why don't we just read it? And Mary said, my soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. He has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from their thrones, but has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, but has sent the rich away empty. He has helped his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he has promised our ancestors. So perhaps the first thing to observe is that this prayer is not really the kind of prayer that you would expect, right? You would expect Mary to be grateful for the promise of a son, but this is not what you get. So scholars wonder whether Luke is here using a psalm or a song that has existed already and puts it into the mouth of Mary. There is, in fact, another song after which this one is modeled, and that is a song in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, namely the Song of Hannah at the beginning of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel 2, Hannah, who is introduced to us as the wife of Elkanah, is the mother of Samuel. And she is barren, she can't have a child, and so she makes a promise. If I get a child, I will dedicate this child to God. And then God gives her a son, and his name is Samuel. If you look at the song that she then sings in 1 Samuel 2, it is very similar to Mary's song, so that it is quite obvious, at least to me, that Luke knew Hannah's song and modeled his own song after Hannah's song.
Not only that, but it's also just as odd, right? She has
It's just
a son,
as odd, exactly.
And she's not saying, thank you, God, for giving me a son. She is saying very similar things to
Very
this,
similar.
right? About
So let's look at the structure of the Magnificat. I propose to you that it has 4 parts. It starts out in verses 46 and 47 with a kind of an introduction in which Mary expresses her joy. And there's some beautiful parallelism. My soul glorifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God, my Savior. This is clearly Hebrew, what we call parallelismus membrorum. It's like a biblical psalm there. And then we have, after this introduction, the next part would be in verses 48 through 50, where Mary relates what God has done to her. And these verses in particular are very close to Hannah's song, as Rabbi Morgan just pointed out. in 1 Samuel 2. Then you have verses 51 through 53, which is the next part, that are a little bit at odds with the narrative context here, because there it seems that God brings about social justice. Right? These are harsh words. God remembers the lowly, but it's not so nice to the rich. And then in the last two verses, in verses 54 and 55, there's yet another topic that's being introduced, namely that God remembers Israel, and in particular the promises God has made to Abraham. So what are we to do with this prayer? Now, I want you to remember three texts in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh. The first one is the Song of Miriam in Exodus 15, the scene that you just mentioned. The Israelites have crossed the Red Sea, and Miriam turns around and says this beautiful, very short prayer. Shiru ladonai ki ga'oga'a, sus v'rochvo ramavayam. Sing to the Lord because he has done a heroic deed. The horse and its rider he has cast into the sea. Quite possibly one of the oldest texts we have in the Hebrew Bible. Right, there's the Song of Moses that comes right before it. It quotes it and then expands on it. But I think that the Song of Miriam may well be one of the earliest texts. Then I want you to think of the Song of Deborah in Judges 5. This is after the battle with Sisera, where there's this beautiful song of victory, which I also think is a very old poem. And then you have the Song of Hannah in 1 Samuel 2 that we've mentioned. And now we add to this Miriam song. So I think these compositions have several things in common. One, they are all recited by a woman. Two, they're all hymns of praise. They glorify God. Three, they all interrupt the narrative. It's very interesting what the storyteller does, right? The action comes to a halt, and the storyteller introduces this poem, which seems to be sometimes at least a bit at odds with its context. And four, all of these songs are in response to God's intervening graciousness and power. So I think what we have here in the Magnificat is a storyteller, Luke, who knows his Hebrew Bible, and he does something very, very similar. He puts into the mouth of Mary a song of victory, glorifying God, which is perfectly in harmony with similar songs in the Hebrew Bible. Leave it with that and go on to the Lord's Prayer. In the New Testament, we find the Lord's Prayer twice in two of the Gospels. First in Matthew chapter 6, at the very center of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is the first of 5 speeches that Jesus gives in the Gospel of Matthew. It begins at the beginning of chapter 5 and ends in chapter 7. And quite deliberately, I think, in the middle of this long speech, Matthew inserts this prayer. Jesus teaches his followers, his disciples, how to pray. And then there's a second version of it in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 11, which is shorter. So let's just read the Lord's Prayer. This is the Lord's Prayer, how it is recited in the Christian liturgy to this very day. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. While most Christians today understand the Lord's Prayer to address everyday needs, I think much can be said in favor of an interpretation that claims that this was originally an eschatological prayer. That is to say, that this prayer was originally meant to talk about the end of time and not about day-to-day needs. So, for example, several scholars have suggested, and I think for very good reason, that hallowed be your name, your kingdom come, and your will be done, really ask God to usher in utopia, really ask God to bring in the world to come, the Olam Haba. The request for daily bread may well turn out to be a prayer for the bread of life and the heavenly manna of the days of the end. The forgive us our trespasses is prayed in view of the coming judgment. There's a certain gravity here. And then, of course, the focal point at the end, deliver us from evil, may not necessarily be a reference to eating too much chocolate. I think there's a certain tendency in Christianity to domesticate this prayer, right? To make it sort of cute. I'm not entirely sure that that was its original meaning. All right, let's look at structure. Here I will take off my Christian hat and put on my professorial hat, for which I profusely apologize. So I'm the English teacher. Now let's look at the structure, and I propose to you that the Lord's Prayer has three parts: an introduction, a middle term, and an end. So the introduction is the first line, is an address, or what we call an invocation. You call on God, our Father who art in heaven. And Rabbi Morgan, who put together all of our handouts, kindly provided you with the Hebrew, lest there be any doubt that this is something that you would never find in Hebrew literature. So the Hebrew there is Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father who is in heaven. Then you have the middle part, and the middle part consists of a list of petitions. And as I will argue in just a second, there are 7 of these petitions. The first one is, hallowed be your name. The last one is, but deliver us from evil. And then the third part, to round it all out at the end, is what we call a doxology. A doxology is a praise of God. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen. Beginning, petitions, and end. I'm interested in the petitions. So let's look at the petitions. There are 7 of them. Let's go through them. First one, hallowed be your name. Second, your kingdom come. Third, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. 4, give us this day our daily bread. 5, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. 6, and lead us not into temptation. 7, but deliver us from evil. Christians like their bells. So there are 2 ways of using your bells. You can peal them and you can toll them. Pealing your bells means ding-a-ling-a-ling. You pull your rope and the bell swings back and forth. Tolling means that there's a hammer on the outside of the bell and it controls what you do. You pull the rope and then you let it go and the hammer goes bong. As you can tell, I'm the master bell ringer at our church. I'm really into this stuff. When the Lord's Prayer is recited, you toll your bell 7 times. 1 toll for each of the 7 petitions. So that who is not in church, should be in church, but is playing tennis, hears the 7 tolls and knows, now the Lord's Prayer is recited.
Do they know for whom the bell tolls?
Exactly, for whom the bell tolls. So the other occasion on which we toll the bells is at a funeral. The funeral starts out with 1 toll for each year a person has lived. At my church, people tend to die in midsummer when they have lived 90 years or so. No reproach, just a statement. All right, let's come back to these 7 petitions. Let's further look at them. I propose to you that they fall into 2 groups, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6, 7. Petitions 1 to 3 are about God, as you can see. Your name, your kingdom, your will. So I want you to note in particular what perhaps we can call the theology of the divine name. Right? The name of God plays a particular role here. And then there's the second group, petitions 4 through 7. And you can see by the language that they are about us. Right? So the camera shifts a bit. So let's look at these 4 petitions a little closer, because I think there's a further structure here for these latter 4 petitions. And what I would like to propose to you is that there are 4 gradually widening circles. We start at the center and then we move out. The first of these 4 petitions is about bread. What is bread? It's about the individual. It's about sustenance. And it's about survival, what we all need. The second petition is about sins. So now we're no longer talking just about the individual, but now we're talking about the individual in relationship with others. or what one would call community. We're widening the circle. The third is about temptation, or time of trial. So this is the petition really not to lose one's faith in the time of trial. And this is ultimately about the relationship of the individual with God. So we're moving from the individual to the community, to the individual with God. And then there's the last petition, namely, but deliver us from evil, which I think, again, is not to be taken lightly. I think this is the widest circle. This is the prayer's focal point, and it is the petition for peace. Ultimate peace, not just nice peace, but ultimate peace. So what do we do with this? Several scholars have suggested that the Lord's Prayer fairly early on took the place of the Amidah, the Shmoneh Esrei, that Rabbi Morgan just explained to us. And there are indeed some striking similarities. There's the request for forgiveness, the request for food. There's the hope for eschatological end-time fulfillment. The central portion of the Shmoneh Esrei, the Amidah, much like the Lord's Prayer, falls into two distinct parts: petitions for the individual, petitions for the nation, the group, the us, the community. And there are early Christian traditions that instruct the believers to say the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day while standing. So there are some striking, I won't call them parallels, but some striking similarities. And I think there's much that we could further explore. So I want to wrap this up by looking briefly at another prayer, namely the Kaddish, which also has some striking similarities with the Lord's Prayer. The one big difference, perhaps, is the doxological language that dominates the Kaddish, the praise language. Although at the same time, there's the praise of God's name again, this theology of the divine name, with which the Lord's Prayer also starts out. Other striking similarities, I think, are the first 2 petitions about the name and the kingdom that are very similar. And again, I would argue the focal point of both prayers is an earnest desire for peace. Ya'aseh shalom aleinu.
Right.
Right?
Yes, so actually I was going to comment on that. You'll look on the next page, on page 3, the last paragraph of the Kaddish says, "He who creates peace in the celestial heights," or we would say in the heavens above, "may he create peace for us and for all Israel." And it just struck me that "your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," sort of echoes that sentiment, right? And I always imagine that phrase in the Kaddish was written by somebody who went camping, although I guess you didn't have to go camping 2,000 years ago to see the stars. Nowadays, you don't see the stars in the cities, but you have to go camping to see them. But anyway, the idea is he's looking up at the heavens above, and he sees the stars, and they seem so peaceful and calm up there. And then he looks down here, and he sees what a mess the world is, and he says, "Boy, God, can you help us to create some of that peacefulness here on earth?" Or, as it says in the Lord's Prayer, "May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Right. Also, by the way, it is the ending of the Kaddish is a prayer for peace. Virtually all strings of prayers in Judaism structures end with a prayer for peace. The grace we recite after meals, the long form, like the 1040, it's tax season now, right? So 1040 with attachments. The long form grace after the meals ends with a prayer for peace. The Kaddish ends with a prayer for peace. The Amidah ends with a prayer for peace. Right? We always end with a prayer for peace.
So to wrap up my portion, and then we move on to the hopes, I'd like to make 3 observations. Why am I doing this? What's the purpose of comparing these prayers? Am I arguing that these prayers are essentially all the same? Absolutely not. That's not what I'm saying. But here's what I'm saying. I want to offer 3 observations. So one, early Christian prayers, much like Jewish prayers today, reached their current form after the Hebrew Bible was basically finished. They have a long history, but they evolved out of earlier forms of prayers that have their origin in what we call the Second Temple period, Beit Sheni. And so basically what we're talking about when we're looking at early Christian prayers as they're preserved in the New Testament and the origins of rabbinic prayers as well, is that they're really siblings. They're really developments of prayers that have deep roots in the Hebrew Bible and that were then formed gradually, perhaps originally in a somewhat loose form, during the Second Temple period. And then at some point, Jesus comes around and the rabbis come around, roughly speaking at the same time, as a matter of fact, inherit these prayers and develop them further. But at this early stage, certainly the early stage when Luke wrote his gospel, when Matthew wrote his gospel, they had not really drifted apart. But they're still operating with the same ideas, the same language, the same theological topoi, if you will. So my first observation is that early Christians, the followers of Jesus, and rabbinic Jews were all inheriting very similar traditions from the sages of the Second Temple period. Secondly, looking at the Magnificat and the Lord's Prayer, I really don't see anything that would be at odds with the thinking and spirituality of the rabbis. I'd be hard-pressed, and perhaps you can correct me, that there are really lines or so that would be offensive or completely at odds with rabbinic teaching. Again, I'm not saying that they're all the same, but I'm struck by the, if you will, compatibility, the similarity, or perhaps we can even say the parallels in the thinking here.
Yeah.
So why is it that we know so little of each other's prayers? Why do we think that we're so far apart? And so that's my third observation is I think the issue here are not the prayers themselves, but the issue is that Christians today don't know the Jewish prayers. And I don't mean to be reproachful.
Jews don't know Christian prayers
either. Jews don't know the Christian prayers.
Right, yeah.
And none of us really know enough about Second Temple, Jewish spirituality and liturgy. I think that's really what it boils down to. That we're really siblings, or whatever metaphor you want to use, two streams that flow from a common source. And that common source originally was the Hebrew Bible, but was channeled through this long period of Second Temple Judaism when these prayers began to form, originally as a way of replacing, as you said earlier on, the sacrifices at the temple.
So, so that takes us to our third part, which is our hopes. Do we have similar ideal visions for what the world ought to look like? Do we have similar visions for what our faith tradition is trying to teach us about how to live a good life? And I suppose after sitting through 3 hours, if you've been to all 3 hours, not surprisingly, you'll see that we're probably going to say, yes, we have similarities. So first we're going to look at one classic statement in the New Testament.
So we're back to Matthew. Towards the end, Matthew tells a story about Jesus being put to the test. So it's a very interesting story. Let's just read it. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they had a little argument about the resurrection of the dead. Didn't go over very well. The Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest command. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourselves." Again, I try to be as brief as I can. Matthew is a little tendentious here in the way in which he sets up the scene, right? So he says the Pharisees go together in order to test him, right? So did they really want to know what Jesus has to say? You can see that Matthew, again, doesn't portray the Pharisees sort of in a neutral way, right? The Pharisees are scheming here. They're putting Jesus to the test. It's not a nice thing. They're not really asking an honest question. And then there is this person who appears, an expert in the law, a lawyer. I don't know why Matthew puts that in. It really doesn't contribute much sort of to the story, a little lashing out at the lawyers. And so they ask him, "Teacher..."
It's an old story.
That's right. "Which is the greatest commandment in the law?" So the assumption here is that not all laws are equal, right? That some laws are more important than others. They put him to the test. So what is so remarkable about Jesus is that he seems entirely unimpressed. He doesn't mind to be tested. There's absolutely nothing polemical in his reply, right? He could have just lashed out at them, but he doesn't. He just lets it wash over him. And what I find most striking about Jesus' response, apart from its brevity, which I laud, is how traditional it is, or how entirely unremarkable his response is. Namely, all he does is he tells this lawyer, the Pharisee, what, of course, he had known all along. Namely, that there are two commandments that he puts together. One is the commandment to love God, and one is to love the neighbor. Why does he put these two commandments together? Because they're both about love. They belong together. And so, for Jesus, they become inseparable. There really is nothing unexpected about Jesus' reply. And there's a commentator on the Gospel of Matthew, a modern commentator, whose name is Dale Ellison, whom I like very, very much. And in his commentary on this section, he writes, and I quote, "Only Christian prejudice will find in Jesus' response a departure from Judaism." So what does Professor Ellison say? What Professor Ellison says is that when this text is read in the churches, it's in the gospel, it's read in the churches a lot, most Christians, of course, will not know the Shema. And most Christians will not know that Leviticus 19 is not just any law. So for most Christians who hear this story, Jesus is just quoting anything in the Old Testament. It comes completely out of nowhere. And the fact that he shuts these people up is a proof of Jesus' superiority. He really got them by saying, love God and love the neighbor, and by golly, they had never thought of that. Right? But when I teach this class and I give them other texts, and one will be from, of course, Pirkei Avot, but there are others in the Bavli, where the exact same argument is made in Judaism, all of a sudden you understand why Jesus is doing what he's doing. So taken out of context, Jesus' reply seems utterly arbitrary. He could have picked just any verse in Leviticus. There are many. But once you see it in the context of Second Temple Judaism, there's nothing arbitrary about this at all. But what is so remarkable is how unremarkable it is, right, that he is completely mainline. He just says, come on, you know the answer. Don't put me to the test. I'm just telling you what you've known already. And they say, okay.
Yeah, actually, the okay part isn't here, but it is in Mark, I think. So this
it's implied.
It's implied here, yeah. So this appears 3 times in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and with different people asking Jesus the question each time. And I just checked them out again this evening. So Mark is the one that afterwards the Pharisee says, yeah, you're right. Those are the most important ones.
Sounds good, yeah.
Yeah, which sort of shows that that's kind of what modern Jews thought at the time, or not modern, that's what ancient Jews thought at the time. It's also, I would say, not a remarkable question that was being asked. The fact that we have several parallels in the Talmud and other places indicates that a lot of Jews were asking the same question. In the Jewish tradition, we believe there are 613 commandments. That's a lot of commandments. And most Jews at the time were poor peasant farmers. And so they're saying to their rabbis, you know, I don't have time for this. I have to go plant my carrots. You know, tell me what I need to know to be a good Jew in a soundbite. So, and the similar answers were being given. The other thing that is typically Jewish, I think, here about Jesus' remark, he's asked what is the most important commandment, and he does a typical Jewish move. Yeah, he fudges, and he doesn't reduce it to one commandment, he reduces it to 2 commandments. Right, yes. Because in essence, you can't reduce Jewish essence to one idea. It has to be 2 ideas, love God and love your fellow human being. But so the text I chose as the parallel is not apparently obvious to it, but I'll show you why it is. And it comes from a section of the Talmud called Avot, which means fathers. And I like to think of it again as the founding fathers of Judaism. They're bits of wisdom for Jews. And in this case, Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Righteous, who was writing about 100 years, or lived about 100 years before Jesus, said the following: on 3 things the world stands. And I think here he meant the Jewish world. The study of Torah, the study of our tradition, on the worship of God and on acts of loving kindness. And the reason I see this as being a parallel to Jesus is because it does another typically Jewish move. First of all, of course, he's not quoting the Bible, right? Jesus quoted the Bible, right? And so Shimon HaTzadik is being a little bit radical here and saying, I don't need to quote the Bible, I'm going to give you my interpretation of the Bible, right? So that's a kind of a radical, but not unlike Pharisaic Jewish move and later rabbinic move. But the more important thing, I think, is he says, it's not enough to love God, and it's not enough to love your fellow human being, right? In Judaism, we often say it's really about what you do in the world that's the most important. So if you really love God, what are you going to do about it? And so he says, worship God, right? And if you really love your fellow human being, prove it. How are you going to prove that you really love your fellow human being? What are you going to do about it? And he says, do acts of loving kindness, right? So it's acting on those two maxims. He adds a third leg to the two, which is the study of our tradition, because he's a scholar and he thinks it's important. So, so that's the sort of answer there. So here I want to wrap up by asking. So one of the questions we've been talking about prayer, and sort of been looking at the big picture and where do we go from here. One of the questions I get asked is, Rabbi, do Jews and Christians pray to the same God? And I mean, after all, we have different concepts of God, certainly with respect to Jesus, who we consider a human being but not divine, and so there's no Trinity for us. But so the question arises, do we pray to the same God? And so in my sort of modern, unorthodox, ecumenical approach, I like to analogize religions to telescopes, right? So, so God is invisible, can't be seen, and therefore you need some kind of an aid to help understand God better, and that's what religions come to do. So just like telescopes are used to look through them to see the moons of Jupiter, so you can see them with which you can't see with your naked eye, you use religion to try and understand God better. It's something you couldn't do on your own without the help of your religious tradition. It turns out that different people need different telescopes. So here I would analogize it to sort of going to the optometrist, right? When you get your refraction for your lenses to know which glasses to wear, right? So he does this thing of better or worse, right? And everybody gets their own specific prescription to help their eyes to see more clearly. So different telescopes seem to work differently or better for different kinds of people. However, there is another twist to this analogy, which is, are we all pointing our telescopes in the same direction? Are we all trying to see the same thing? And here, I would say, again, as an ecumenical, unorthodox rabbi, the questions for me are two. Number one, does your telescope help you to live a richer spiritual life? Personally, do you have do you feel like you have a closer encounter with God, however you understand God? And secondly, does it inspire you to do good things in the world, to improve the world, to love your fellow human being, to make the world a better place, to treat God's creation in a way that's commensurate with understanding the Creator? Or as Jesus said, do you love God and do you love your fellow human being? Right? Those two questions, if your religion helps you to do both of those, then you must be pointing your telescope in the right direction.
So I too have thought how best to wrap this up, and I come back in my thoughts time and again to Paul, the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, who in his last letter that he wrote, the letter to the Romans, spends 3 chapters, chapters 9, 10, and 11, on trying to figure out how this new thing, it's not yet Christianity, the followers of Jesus, how that relates to Israel. And if you read these 3 chapters, he's really working through this as a Jew, trying to figure this out. And he uses a metaphor, which I think to this day is unbeaten. It's still, to me, the most helpful metaphor. He uses the metaphor of the olive tree. And he turns to those non-Jews who are following Jesus. And he tells them, by believing in Jesus, God has grafted you into the tree. You are now part of this tree. And then he turns that around on them and says, but be careful. And I just want to read from Romans 11. This is, again, at the end of Romans 9 through 11, a few verses to you of what Paul there says, addressing specifically the Gentiles who have come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah of Israel. So he says, you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. This is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand only through faith. So do not become proud, but stand in awe. For if God did not spare the natural branches, perhaps he will not spare you. So what Paul says to the Gentiles is, yes, you were grafted onto the tree, meaning God has opened up the covenant with Israel to you. However, God might just as well take you out again. And so Paul ends his reflection there with a severe word of warning and a call to humility. That to me is key. I am greatly saddened when I hear from fellow Christians that Jews need to convert to Christianity, or sometimes worse, that all Jews will go to hell. It's wrong on so many levels, but at least two. One is it completely misunderstands the origins of Christianity, right? It completely misunderstands the fact that Christianity emerged out of Judaism, that there's nothing superior. We talked about supersessionism, but rather that we are children, we are branches grafted into this tree. And the second thing it completely misses is Paul's humility. God might as well take you out again. So watch out what you're saying. Those Christians would do very, very well to hear the Apostle Paul.
Okay.
So I think we keep it with that. Thank you very much. And
Thank
we'll
you.
open it up to questions. Do you want to
So yeah, so we have a microphone over here, just one microphone, I guess, over here. If anybody has any questions to follow up. No question over there? No mic. I
No
see.
mic.
Only one microphone.
All right,
Okay.
good. So one microphone, good.
No questions for the evening?
That would be great.
No questions?
No questions, concerns, jokes? Yeah, again, go ahead.
I can ask it from here.
What would
Sorry.
Christianity do to raise the conscience of the Christian world that because of Jesus they have a connection with Israel?
Uh-huh.
Because as far as I know, it is not preached or taught
Right.
or encouraged.
You're talking about the state of Israel or the people of
Yes,
Israel?
through the Jewish Israel and the Jewish world,
Yes,
Right.
that without Jesus there was no connection.
correct.
But
So your question is, what do Christians need to do to realize this?
yes,
Maybe we should repeat the question because
that conscience be raised.
Yes. So if I understand you correctly, your question is, what needs to happen for Christians to understand their connection to Judaism, and more specifically, that their connection to Judaism is through Jesus? That's your question. And the answer is to become more conscious of Jesus' Judaism, Jesus' own roots, the Jewish elements in the New Testament. We talked about this repeatedly when we read texts from the New Testament, and to take this seriously in Christian theology. That is to say, not just say that was just the history, the historical context, but to find theological relevance in Jesus' own. That is to say, does your preaching change? Does your way in which you think about Christianity change if you take seriously that God chose to send his son into ancient Israel and to have God's son be raised a Jew? And I think the answer is for many Christians, no, it does not change their thinking. That is to say, very few Christians would reject that thinking, right? I mentioned earlier that I've written a book on this. I'm now getting feedback. I was curious, what kind of pushback will I get? And I don't get any pushback by claiming that Jesus was a Jew. But what does it mean? That's where the music starts to play. That's where I get questions.
I have two questions, both of which relate to changes in the original text. One question for Professor Henze, one for Rabbi Morgan. First, for Professor Henze, I understand that the Pope proposes to change the Lord's Prayer, specifically the section that says, "Lead us not into temptation." And I don't quite understand, is the Pope saying, well, the translations are no good? Or is he saying, well, the translations are okay, yeah, that's what Jesus said, but I can improve on what Jesus said?
Yeah, I'm not I'm not an expert on the Pope, so I will not. I know not good. Probably has to do with translation, but again, I won't go into that.
Okay. Second one's for Rabbi Morgan. What's the kind of legislative history or disputes that went on in the changing of Isaiah's language as incorporated into the Amidah? So instead of saying Yotzer Uvarei Choshech, Oseh Shalom Uvarei Et,
Right.
it doesn't say Rasha, it says Hakol.
Yes, correct.
Did people, I can understand why nobody wants to have
Right.
it that much in your face, but who argued about that? Who decided it? And how did it happen?
Okay, so let me first of all explain the question for people who don't know. So the first blessing before the Shema, right, in the evening talks about bringing on the evening and the sun, moon, and stars. In the morning, it's about light, and it quotes a little snippet from Isaiah that says, God created darkness and light, Oseh Shalom Uvarei et Hara. And he also created peace and evil, or goodness and evil. That's what Isaiah said. The rabbis who wrote our prayers decided that that may be a little bit disturbing to the people in the pews, and so they changed the last word from Oseh Shalom Uvarei et Hakol. He creates peace and everything. Right? So Isaiah's point in saying that God creates evil was to say that there's no duality. There's no good God and a bad God. Everything that exists in the world is from God. So things that we perceive as bad, you know, and there's a question about whether they're really bad or not, but things we perceive as bad also come from God. Only one creator. But the terminology is a little bit shocking, and so the rabbis changed the word to Hakol. Who changed it and why, I don't really know. But that was apparently considered an acceptable change. Other changes they didn't make, but that one they did make. Yeah.
There are questions there in the back. So
Hopefully a quick question. I'd just like to know, in the Christian prayers, are there any selections from what you would call the Old Testament included? Because I know you selected certain ones here,
Sure.
you know, from Luke and things
Sure.
like that.
yeah, plenty. So I mentioned, I think, Isaiah 6 at the beginning. The Psalms are all over. And even if we go down the Lord's Prayer and the Magnificat, of course, it is all quotations from Scripture. In fact, when Rabbi Morgan and I talked about this, he brought to my attention, I went through a long list.
Right.
You want to give your
Yeah,
example?
so at the end of the Lord's Prayer where it says, yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, we say something virtually identical, which actually comes from 1 Chronicles chapter 29. When we take the Torah out and parade it around the synagogue, we say, Lecha Adonai hagedula v'hagavura v'hatiferet v'hanetzach v'hahod, right? Which is, yours, God, are the greatness, the might, the splendor, and the triumph and majesty, all that is in heaven and on earth. The Lord, to you, Lord, belong kingship and preeminence, right? So very similar. What happened was the Lord's Prayer clearly written, I think, out of that worldview that, you know, that Chronicles is writing. Somebody who knew the Bible well and was
Right.
sort of summarizing it.
Thank you. Okay.
Oh, there's no
speak
microphone
up.
there?
Speak
Oh,
up.
dear.
Just speak up.
You might have mentioned it in the first class, and I wasn't here. But Christianity's relationship with Judaism, has it changed with the Reformation, or is there a difference between the Roman Catholic and the Reformation?
Right, yes, that's a great question. So the question is, how do different Christian groups relate to Judaism, and what was the impact of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century? That would be several classes of the sort of basically you're asking Jewish-Christian relations over 2,000 years. Of course, the Reformation has changed everything. The Reformation, the key figure in the Reformation was, of course, Martin Luther, who towards the end of his life wrote very unfortunate tractates against the Jews, which were then, if you look at the history of reading of these tractates, completely forgotten. They were not recited, not incorporated in the Lutheran Church until the Nazis came along and celebrated them and dug them out again. And that became then part of the Lutheran Church. And since then, there have been, after the Shoah, there have been several declarations by various denominations. And of course, you mentioned at the beginning of our meeting Vatican II, that respond to Nazi Germany and the Shoah. You want to add to this, because
Well, I
you
would
have
just
looked
say
into this?
specifically that the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, of which Matthias Henze is a parishioner and his wife is a minister, has specifically denounced the anti-Semitic statements of Luther.
Right, right.
Professor Henze stressed the importance to a Christian of belief in Jesus. Rabbi Morgan discussed what Jews should do. And if we see a man who is charitable, treats his family well, welcomes strangers, attends the synagogue, keeps kosher, we'd say he's a good Jew. We don't ask whether he believes in a burning bush or Sinai. What kind of role does belief play in Judaism?
In Judaism? Yeah, so as a rabbi, I would say, the tradition, of course, wants people to believe that there is a God, that God created the universe, that God loves his creatures, and he wants us to be good and take care of the planet he gave us. However, our tradition does teach, by and large, you can always find a variety of opinions, certainly in Judaism, but I would say by and large, the general consensus is that what God really cares about most is not what you think, but what you do in the world. Your actions are more important, and that's in many, many places in rabbinic literature that's stated. But that's not to say you're not supposed to believe that there's a God, but we believe that God mostly cares about what we do in the world. And I would say that this is, maybe anthropomorphizing God somewhat, but, as a parent, right, I'm much more concerned that I want my son to believe in Judaism and God, but ultimately I want him to be a good, decent human being and to make the world a better place. So I assume God, who's the heavenly parent, wants the same thing for all of us. And I will leave it up to God to make those calls, right, in the end.
So I would like to end by thanking Rabbi Morgan again, who really was the motor behind this, whose idea was this series. And I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me and the Christians in the room for opening up your beautiful, beautiful synagogue. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for coming.
Thank you, thank you. So, thank you all for coming, and hopefully we'll have future dialogues and more engagement in the future. I think it's a great thing. Let me just end on this one thing. We have a very polarized country right now, obviously, and I've said this in a few interfaith venues now. I think that religious people who've had a lot of experience with fighting about religious ideas and beliefs and opinions and getting very contentious and even violent about it, religious people who have now realized the error of those ways and are now doing dialogues like this, that is to say, all of us in this room, have an obligation as religious people to try and set a good example for the rest of the country about how to have civil disagreements and how to let people have their own opinions and not, consider the other person the enemy just because they have a different opinion about something. And maybe they actually have some element of truth, and we should listen and hear what they have to say, because maybe it'll affect how we think as well. And so I really hope that these interfaith dialogues can be more than just us having a nice evening together, but really kind of try and model what I hope would be more civil behavior for the rest of the country, which we desperately, desperately need right now. Thank you.